Okay, this video is going to talk a little bit about the concept of a meso compound. Now, a meso compound is a special type of stereoisomer that occurs, and it's important for you to think about the presence of a meso compound when you're considering diastereomers. So here's a molecule we're going to look at. It looks like a lot like the molecule we had in the last video, except for one important difference. In the last video, we had a chlorine and a bromine, making the molecule asymmetrical. But here we have two chlorines, and that leads to some symmetry in this molecule. You can notice the symmetry by saying, well, there's two chiral carbons, and each of the substituents on those chiral carbons is actually the exact same thing. We've got a chlorine, hydrogen, methyl group, and the rest of the molecule. We've got the exact same things on this carbon, methyl, hydrogen, chlorine, the rest of the molecule. This symmetry, it leads to a little bit of trickiness and complexity when we start thinking about all the possible different stereoisomers, and leads to the concept of a meso compound, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But before we do, let's talk about, let's just try to label the stereochemistry of each of these chiral carbons, just like we did in the last video. Here's our fourth substituent, here's our first, third, second in terms of ranking. And so to me this looks like an S stereochemistry. This guy over here, 1, 4, 3, 2. This also looks S to me. So this looks like the SS version of this molecule. Now let's bring up the other possibilities here. Okay, and again we would predict maybe there might be 4 possible stereoisomers for this, and let's go ahead and label them. This looks opposite of what's up here. We have to be careful with that, but to make something opposite in stereochemistry, 2 of the 4 things have to switch position. So here I can see the methyl group is still in the same position, but the hydrogen and the chlorine have switched. That means it has switched stereochemistry, and this is the R version. This looks like the chlorine and hydrogen have switched also. RR, these are enantiomers of each other. And so over here I might imagine, well, this looks the same as over here, so it's S. This looks the same as down here, so it's R, and this is both switched, so S, R. Now often students sort of stop right here and say, this is the situation. We've got 4 possible stereoisomers, just like we had in the last video, but the presence of this symmetry makes things complex. And it turns out that 2 of these stereoisomers are not different from each other. They're actually identical to each other, and they represent what we call the meso compound. And it turns out that the 2 that are identical to each other are these 2. The RS and the SR aren't different stereoisomers. They are the exact same molecule, and we call this the meso compound. And it means that these is just one thing. It's just one compound. So we have a total really of 1, 2, 3 stereoisomers. Now, why are these the same? Why is this the same? Well, it's really due to the presence of this symmetry, that both of the chiral carbons have the same 4 things attached to them. And let me try to illustrate that a little bit. Okay, if we have 2 sides to a compound that are different from each other, we might say one of them's a square and the other one's a circle. Right? And these squares and circles could be R's or S's. And so for a compound that does not have symmetry associated with it, we might imagine that we do have 4 possible stereoisomers, none of which are identical to each other. Right? Here are the 4 possible ones we had in our last interview, or our last video, sorry, and none of them are the same. There's no way I can sort of just rotate one of these and have it look the same. It just doesn't work, right? Now for molecule like this that does have symmetry, what we're saying is, one side of the molecule looks the same as the other side. And so we might imagine labeling the 4 possibilities that we might think about and seeing if 2 of them are actually the same as each other. So here's the symmetrical molecule. The right side looks the same as the left. And it turns out these 2 things are actually the same. If we just took this molecule and flipped it 180 degrees, it would be SR, right? And those would be the exact same molecules. We can't do that with this one because RR is never going to turn to SS. But it doesn't matter whether the S is on the left and the R is on the right or vice versa. It's the same thing. Usually, another way to think about this is if you've taken any genetics, to think about a Punnett square, right? If we have a heterozygous cross, what we're saying is we have 2 symmetrical homologous chromosomes, right? Mom may give big R and a little r, dad, big R, little r, and you might imagine we usually think of this Punnett square as having 4 possibilities, each of the homologous chromosomes independently combining with the other. But usually we think, well, what are the possible genotypes? Well, there's only 3, right? Homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and this heterozygous. It doesn't matter whether dad gave the little r or mom gave the little r. These 2 genotypes are identical to each other because the chromosomes they came from are homologous. There's symmetry between the 2. Big R, little r is the same as little r, big R. 3 possibilities, just like there's 3 possibilities for the Meso compound. Now let me try to illustrate and try to convince you that the RS and the SR are actually the exact same molecule. Let's look at them on this screen. Here we've got the molecules we were just talking about. Here's one chirocarbon, here's the other. And if you look, I've just switched the stereochemistry on the chirocarbons between these 2 molecules, really just by switching the chlorine and the hydrogen positions, right? Chlorine up, hydrogen at you, hydrogen up, chlorine at you, and the same for the other. Now let's try to see if these are identical molecules, if we can rotate one so it looks like the other one. Right now they don't really look identical, but let's see if I can rotate this sort of around. Might take me a while. Well, maybe not. Let's look at this. This might be better. Okay. So it turns out these are identical molecules. I can't get this thing rotated perfectly. But if we look at least at the stereochemistry of each of these chiral centers, we can see that the substituents are in the same relative locations in 3-dimensional space. Hydrogen's pointing at us, chlorine's up, methyl over here, the rest of the molecule to the right. And the same for this chirocarbon. Here's chlorine coming at us, hydrogen pointing away from us, just like here, and the methyl group sort of up. So both of these are identical molecules and represent the Meso compound. And again, usually, or that always occurs when you have a degree of symmetry in the molecule, and the RS then is identical to the SR.